Welcome back. Today we're going to take a look at the Tanchjim Tanya. And this one started off in a fun way. Fellow YouTuber Michael Bruce, super smart guy, says you gotta buy the Tanya. The Tanya is going to be the blonde killer. So this is kind of late on a weekend night and I'm bored. I'm like, okay, I'm in. So we buy it and I'm kind of looking over it and I'm like, they tuned this thing to harm and target. It's probably an MH755 killer, not necessarily a blonde killer. He's like, no, it's the blonde killer. I say, fine, we'll find out in a couple weeks. So here we are, a few weeks later, and we're going to go over and talk about those two issues. But so first, we ended up buying them on Shenzhen Audio, $23.99 today. So it's about the same on AliExpress, maybe $1 or $2 difference. So inexpensive. I saw Alex Hong's review yesterday. He says it looks like the Dyson blow dryer, and I sort of have to agree with that. It's got this almost open back with a mesh look to it, bullet style, hang down. These are not the stock tips. These are KZ flip tips for a big open bore size style. So quite nice. They say you can't really read it with lighting. It says Tanchjim and it says Tanya on the other side. So very nice, hang down, bullet style, lightweight. There's actually a whole story on their design, on their website, so quite nice. So when we get into it, so let's kind of start with the obvious. Is it an MH755 killer? Is it a blonde killer? Which one is it? So I will sort of stick with what I initially thought. I will say I could live without the MH755 now with the Tanya. I think it pretty much is an MH755 killer replacement. I think it just sounds better than the MH755. And a lot of that is, what was the biggest complaint on the 755 was the upper mids get a little shouty. So they dropped it down a little bit and kind of addressed that issue. Is it a BL03 killer? Yeah, I don't know. I'm sure Michael will say it is, and he is right. And I think for a certain class of people who are not impressed with the mids, those cloudy, mid-bass bleeding mids who didn't really like that on the BL03, the Tanya is going to be better for you. So, but if you're a BL03 fan and you really love it, is this a better BL03 set? No, it's not more of the same. It's different and it's cleaner. And if you think that's better, then yeah, it's better. But if you are enjoying your blondes, then this isn't necessarily adding to your blondes. It's something slightly different, and it's actually quite a nice complementary pair as well. So I will put it in that category as opposed to the blonde killer. So second thing that mainly I got hung up on was it gave me BL01 flashbacks, and that was the one that, it's a $15 set that required a $100 amp. And this one, it absorbs volume and power kind of like a sponge. You can keep on clicking, and this thing just keeps on getting louder and louder with no distortion, and it sounds better and better. So there was a bit of that flashback to this. It's not. You can certainly drive it with a phone, but it will certainly sound much better with some kind of powered amp and more headroom on the volume and all of that stuff. So it definitely gave me flashbacks of this. Now I'm going to have to tell people that it's a $20, very affordable set that you don't necessarily want to plug into your phone, and you really need to plug it into an amp. So I will put it in that category of it sounds better with an amp. What do you do if you don't have an amp? Use these open style tips, because if you don't use the open style tips, it's quite bassy and maybe a little muddy, and perhaps reversing some of that design that they put into it in the first place. So open bore tips, and I even gave it a treble boost, just a very slight one, just to bring up that treble level to make it a little more fun and engaging. And I think that gets you most of the way to having either a much higher volume level or having an amp with more headroom and more volume. So that's what I did for a couple days or two. I'll still say it sounds better with more volume, but the treble boost actually gets you most of the way there. So what does that sound like? It sounds what they said it was supposed to sound like. Harman, the IE target, but it has a blonde level mid bass bump, but not as boomy, not as bleedy as the BL03, so it's a much cleaner sound. Extended at both sides, but the treble is too polite, I would put it, and that's kind of why I said you really need a boost up here. Just for my personal preference, it just needed a little help, so I'll say it's a little too polite. But, on my very first impression, putting it into my ears, I would say it's more like a BL03, but more balanced, so not as bottom heavy. A much more balanced sound compared to the BL03. So let's look at the graph really quickly, and this one came from Super Reviews, and I want to thank him for putting this Tanya graph out quite early. I don't think he's actually done a review yet, but he graphed it early, which was great. So again, when we look at the bass side, so MH755 is way up there, and then the BL03 is in red, that's kind of up there. And then the Tanya actually rolled it off, so it's not nearly as boomy. You're going to miss some of that rumble they get on a 03. And that's one of the main reasons why I say it's not a blonde killer for me, is it just doesn't have that heavy, thick, rumbly low end that the 03s have. And so switching over to Tanya, you're going to miss that bit. But, after about 70 or so, the red and the green, the Tanya and the BL03 basically track each other until you get into the mids. Then, as I said, so not everyone's complaint, but one of the more complaints on the 755 which is the yellow line, was this rise into the upper mids. And that's why Tanya in the green level took it down a notch. So not as shouty, it's not shouty at all, which is a great attribute to have compared to the 755. And then if you look at the 03, it had a much lower treble level, which was yet another complaint. So the Tanya ends up sort of being between the two. So it's very difficult to say it's a killer on either one of them. It has better attributes in different places than either of them. So, I think it is a great set, and depending on who you are and what you'd like to listen to, it, addressed these issues or didn't address these issues. So do consider how you view either of those sets. So moving on. So like I said, the bass, it's got this tight, swift, controlled sound. It's not boomy. It's not loose. It's just kind of tight and a little on the fast side. It needs more rumble. And I'll say they tried to lean towards quality over quantity, except for the mid-bass bump there. But I'm not sure they 100% succeeded in a great bass. For me, it wasn't the star of the set. It sounds okay, but it is really hard to point to something about the bass that I say, wow, I haven't heard that before. But if you really hated that big boomy style on the BL03, it's definitely better than that, but it can still use more detail and more texture. And I think they really did try to keep those mids clean versus really rumbling your ears or giving a really heavy bottom end. I think that was just their design goal, and I think they achieved that, but at the expense of the BL03 fans who really like that rumble at the bottom, not necessarily there. So, and also I think an amp does help a bit, like the BL01. It actually tightens it up, makes it a little more present. Not a huge difference, but I think it does help, just like it did on the BL01. So the mids are the star of the show, and if you follow Tanchjim and the Oxygen, you know that the Oxygen mids are kind of the star of that set as well. So part of the reason why I jumped into the Tanya without thinking too much about it was, well, if I can get a little bit of knowing of what the Oxygen sounds like, because I don't have the Oxygen, that would be huge. And I think, just reading reviews of Oxygen, and Michael Bruce will talk about that because Oxygen is one of his great sets. I think he'll get a better description of how close those mids are to the Oxygen or something else, but they are really, really good. And I sort of had this feeling that they're just reading Oxygen reviews, that it's in that ballpark, and they're very well done. So, but the biggest issue that I have in the mid is it needs a lot of volume. And I really focused on this track, Georgia Smith's Blue Lights, the orchestra version. It's actually the Machiavelli Sessions version. And if you just turn on, like, this is my ES100, and this is in performance mode, and I usually keep it, probably 35% volume. At 35% volume, she is almost offset. She is set back a bit from the mic, almost recessed. She just sounds offset, like she's just not close enough, it's not intimate enough, it's not detailed enough. And as you click volume, keep on increasing it, she gets closer and closer to the mic. And there's a point at which she stops getting closer to the mic, and you're hearing her full voice. It's filling your head, and it's great. It's a great vocal. And those female vocals, and I think Alex Hong actually pointed out the same thing, the female vocals, even at high volume levels, not shouty, her voice sounds great, but she stops getting closer to the mic, and then the orchestra fills in. So when I said the treble was too polite, the volume helps a lot because those levels come up quite a bit. You get a little more bass out of it, but mostly it's the treble fills in, and the whole thing sounds almost perfectly in balance. But you really have to focus on something, and I focused on her voice and keep on raising the volume beyond the point at which she is filling your head, because she's almost right between your ears, not in front of you, but between your ears, and very detailed and very rich and very nice. But you have to get it to that level, and at some point you sort of realize that even at loud levels, this thing isn't shouty. It has some unreal volume scaling going on, and it's a bit odd. Maybe it's BL01 like. I didn't notice it as much on the BL01, but on this one, you can actually listen to it at some really unreal volume levels that on performance on the ES100 that I've never listened to a $20 set on. This one will hit it without any problems and go way beyond it. So get her voice to the point where it's right there in the middle and it's big and it sounds beautiful. The orchestra will sound behind her and around her just the way as it should. The whole stage should actually open up at the right volume. And again, you'll kind of point back to this. Those horns really need that lower body. They're missing a little bit of that rumble, but the strings are there and they're not too polite. They're at a level which they sound great as well, and natural and emotive. At lower volumes, again, those strings are going to be a little lower. They can be boosted with a little bit of EQ, but do pay attention to those as well. So as I said, the volume helps detail, layering, separation. All these things sound better at higher volumes on the Tanya. And when it's dialed in, it easily competes with the $50 range. But, you're essentially taking $20, adding some kind of amp to it, and saying it beats a $50 set that may not need an amp or runs fine off your phone. So it definitely competes there. It's just how you view that cost and whether it's beating something because it requires other hardware or crazy volume, whatever it is. But sounds good. Sounds great, in fact, on the mids when you get it all dialed in. So the treble, again, I think Tanchjim has this very natural sound to it. Their house sound tends to be more natural. The treble level is not thin. The level's in balance with the bass. And as I said, the bass isn't crazy. They actually rolled off the sub to make it more balanced. And when you look at the two together, again, in balance with the bass. So more extension, you get more extension, and this thing really comes alive. If you've never heard a set come alive, there's a certain volume level where this one goes from almost a flat, neutral, dullish sound to very engaging, fun, and I would call that coming alive. And that's what happens when you either add some volume or EQ to this one. There's a sort of minimum volume that you need to get it to the point where it sounds optimal. And so, as I said, the fun comes out at higher volumes, and it almost sounds like a slight V, where the bass not so much, but the treble becomes apparent compared to where it is at lower volumes. The treble actually pops out a little bit, and it almost sounds like it's boosted just a little bit, but really just that fun and engagement and a presence in the treble level at higher volumes as well. So staging, and like everything else, at lower volumes, everything runs together a little bit more. It's a little bit more narrow than it should be, and it gets to one of these points where you listen to it or you turn it on the next day and the volume is too low and you're kind of shaking your head like, this doesn't sound right, something is wrong. And you realize that, because the night before I turned down the volume. But you get something like her voice, and it just doesn't sound right at lower volumes after you listen to it at much higher volume. So same thing with the staging. There's not enough of anything at the lower volumes, but then when you go to higher volumes, much more separation, better imaging, better layering. The whole stage opens up, and you get some more height and depth out of it that doesn't really exist at the lower volume. So again, that's a lot of turning up the volume, please, on the Tanya, because it sounds great if you get it to that point. But if that's not your style of listening, I would suggest that definitely use open tips and maybe a little bit of EQ to get that treble level kind of, I think it's slightly below polite, to get it to polite and maybe a little more presence and engagement and fun. So that's it. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.